Because we have Father, Son, Holy Spirit, each being God. There is one God, but we don't want to identify Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. And so, how can we reconcile this? It looks as if the doctrine is simply contradictory. So it's very important to understand how this is possible. Tertullian puts it this way. He says, one way of understanding this is that God must in some sense be a unity, and yet in another sense a trinity. And so we've got to frame it that God is both three and one. But what do you mean, both three and one? If I hold up three fingers, I can't very well say three and one. Well, except maybe I can. I can say three fingers, one hand. And so maybe we can introduce something like that. So in other words, we can frame the problem this way. We can think, in other words, there must be one, well, for example, hand, three fingers, so one, presumably God, there is one God, so it's not too hard to figure out how to fill that in, but now three whats? That turns out to be very difficult. And in fact, in the Greek East, it turns out to be terribly difficult, because there is not only a great history of Greek philosophy and an understanding of metaphysics that says, as did Aristotle, these are the basic categories of things in the world, so the natural thing to do is to try to fill in one of those categories. But also, we've got an understanding derived in part from Aristotle of Greek language, Greek culture, and the possibilities for filling in such a blank. The result is that in Greek, it's very hard to do this in a way that people can make sense of in traditional categories. Now, Tertullian does not even try. In Latin, he refuses to fill this in with anything that already has some kind of metaphysical or grammatical signification. He says, one God, three persons. And he's the first person to talk about the persons of God. Now, Tertullian is introducing a major innovation here. And not only a major innovation in using that term, but also a major innovation in the sense of recognizing that this is not something he wants to understand in terms of what a human person is, for example, or in terms of persona in the sense of like a role or an aspect of personality or something like that. It's not like that. It is being used as a technical term. So Tertullian's idea here is that what constitutes the Trinity, the three parts of God, or the three aspects, or the three, well, whatever's, the three persons of God, is not something that we can understand in a traditional category. This is something new. And so Tertullian's position is, don't think here we have three substances, or three relations, or three times, or three aspects, or three states, or three actions, or in any other way, something that is to be identified as something that would be natural and understandable if we were talking about human beings or other categories. I will separately run through Aristotle's categories and just see why this becomes so difficult. But in Latin, there isn't that kind of metaphysical theory already sitting around that specifies the acceptable categories that you might substitute there. And Tertullian, even if there were, would stress it is different. God is a being unlike other beings. God is not like a marker. God is not like a human person. God is different. And so we need a different kind of category, a different kind of term. God, he says, is one and three. One God, but three, well, we need a new term. A term for a relationship that we have not encountered before. And so he simply says, let's use person, persona in the Latin for that term. Well, then God is three personae. But that is not to be understood as simply a reference to a substance or object like you and me. It is not a question of simply the mode or aspect or some property of a substance. It is not to be understood as a relation of a substance. It is something new, something distinctive, something different. There's one more thing we need to understand in thinking about the problem of the Trinity from Tertullian's point of view. How do we establish the consistency of something? Well, there are a variety of ways of trying to go about doing it, But one of the standard techniques is to specify a model to show how something like that could be true. And that's what Tertullian proceeds to do. It's how, for example, mathematicians were able to prove the consistency of non-Euclidean geometries. They were able to specify a model within Euclidean geometry that would make the non-Euclidean axioms true. And similarly, in set theory, when people wanted to establish the consistency of the axiom of choice or of the generalized continuum hypothesis, what did they do? They developed a model within set theory showing you that that's something that could be modeled within some part of set theory. When they wanted to show the independence of those things, what did they do? They showed that the negation of it could also be modeled. And so what we're going to do here is look at Tertullian's model, actually 3 models, appropriately enough, of how we might understand the consistency. Now, I want to make clear, he is not saying that the relationship between Father, Son, and Holy Spirit is precisely analogous to the relationships he's talking about. He is saying there is something here that shows you this idea of 3 in 1 is not absurd. It is not a contradiction. It's something that we do have a kind of model of, in fact, multiple models of. So let's take a look at the models. The first model he talks about concerns the sun. Already Plato talks about the sun a lot as something like an analog of God when he discusses the cave allegory. And so there is something there that gets picked up by Philo, by Origen, by a variety of other thinkers. If we think of the sun as in some sense analogous to the Father, well, Tertullian says we can also think then about the ray, or about what he refers to as the apex. Now, what do we mean, the apex? It's not entirely clear. Apex normally just means the highest point. Here, if I understand what he's referring to, he's talking about where the ray of sunlight actually hits something. So you and I might say, oh, let's get out of the sun on a hot day. Well, we weren't literally in the sun. The idea was we were in the sunshine. And so it's something like the sun, the ray of light emerging from the sun, and then something like the sunshine as it strikes an object. That's one model. He says, in one sense, there's only one thing there, the sun. On the other hand, we can draw a distinction between the sun, the light, and then the light as it strikes an object and illumines it. The second model is the root, the main trunk of the tree, and then the fruit. That too, he says, is a kind of model of the Trinity. There is, in a sense, one thing here. Look at the apple tree with the fruit hanging on it. There is the root, there is the tree trunk, there is the fruit, and yet there is one tree. These are, in some ways, instructive models. In other ways, they're imperfect, and I'll come back to that. But let's look at the last one. That is by far the most influential model that he advances. That is the one between the fountain, the river, and the stream, as it's usually translated, or to use different language, something like a spring, the river that proceeds from it, and then the delta part, the separating out into various streams. In any case, these are the 3 models he discusses. He says we can think about the sun, the light proceeding from the sun, the light striking an object. We can talk about the root, the tree trunk, the fruit. We could talk about a fountain or spring, the river, and then the stream. All of these things are models of one thing, in a sense, with, well, that are also 3. Now, we have to be careful, because it's tempting, for example, in the case of the tree, to think these are simply parts of the tree, the root, the trunk, and the fruit. We can't similarly say these are simply parts of the sun, however. These, the spring, the river, and then the stream that as it trickles along, let's say after people have used it for irrigation or other purposes, or when it goes into the delta, those are things that similarly are, in a sense, one thing, one body of water. But notice there are relations among these. These are, in some sense, a source. This is something that proceeds from that source, as is this. And so Tertullian says all of these have a certain kind of similarity. Now, it's not a perfect similarity. And throughout the history of these discussions, people introduce various models for trying to understand all of this. Well, the one that, as I mentioned, is by far the most influential, that affects Athanasius and Anselm especially, is this last one. And they will elaborate that considerably, Anselm perhaps in its highest form, to illustrate not only how these things are possible, but how additional aspects of this that we might want, that I mentioned earlier, are also going to follow. The point of the models, though, is not to say the relationship between Father, Son, and Holy Spirit is exactly like that. Instead, it's simply to say, here is a model to establish consistency. It looks as if these claims are inconsistent, as if they simply give us a contradiction, that there is one God and that there are at least three gods. But he says, try to understand. There is a way of understanding them as consistent, and here are three models that demonstrate that consistency. So, at this point, we don't have any account of how they are three exactly. In fact, he thinks it isn't exactly like this. After all, that's why we had to introduce a technical term. But notice here, we don't really have a term for it either. We can't really understand the relationship between the sun and the light coming from the sun in Aristotelian terms. Nor could we understand the relationship between the fountain, the river, and the stream. And so I think these models are not only there to demonstrate consistency, but also to make the point that if you're looking, as the Greek thinkers do, for an Aristotelian category to fill in the blank after the three, you're bound to be frustrated. These examples show you that metaphysics isn't adequate. You need other things. And indeed, that is part of his justification for saying there's nothing bizarre about introducing a new technical term and saying this is a different kind of relationship. It's something we need to do anyway in a variety of contexts for a variety of different relationships. So there are more things on heaven and earth, Horatio, than are dreamt of in your philosophy, says Hamlet. Here too we can say that Tertullian thinks there are more things on heaven and earth than are dreamt of in Greek philosophy.